There is a file in the CIA's classified archive that most people will never read. It was filed on December 26, 2024, the morning after Christmas. The cover page carries no name, no photograph, no date of birth, just a call sign typed in capital letters, Sierra 7, and below it, a single handwritten note in the margin from Commander Garrett Morrow of SEAL Team 6. The note reads, "Revise all recruitment criteria, every single one." No one asked him to explain that note. No one needed to. What happened in the Hindu Kush Mountains on the night of December 24, 2024, was witnessed by 11 operators, one CYOA handler, one rescued diplomat, and one 10-year-old Afghan girl, who would later describe her rescuer as an angel that came out of the snow. The official record says 12 enemy combatants were neutralized. It says 0 friendly casualties. It says the mission was a success. What the official record does not say is that the person responsible for most of that outcome was 15 years old. This is that story, not the version in the file. The real one. Cut to 3 hours before the note was written. Cut to a Chinook helicopter clawing through a blizzard at 11,000 feet above sea level, its twin rotors fighting wind that had no interest in letting it pass. The temperature outside was -18 Celsius. Inside the cargo bay, it was barely warmer. 12 operators from SEAL Team 6 sat in the kind of silence that only comes to men who have done this enough times to stop pretending they are not afraid. Their faces were covered, their weapons were checked and rechecked. They were professionals in every sense of the word. And then there was the figure at the rear of the cargo bay. She sat with her back against the fuselage, a TAC-3-3-8 sniper rifle laid across her thighs. The rifle was nearly as long as she was tall. She weighed 119 pounds. She stood 5 feet 3 inches on a good day. Her dark hair was pulled back and tucked under a watch cap, and she was making small adjustments to her scope with the kind of focused calm that surgeons have in the middle of an operation, the calm that is not the absence of pressure, but the mastery of it. Her name was Sloane Cross. She was 15 years old. The laughter started quietly. The way laughter does when grown men are trying to be professional about something they find genuinely absurd. Boone Whitaker, 12-year veteran, 3 combat deployments, a man who had earned every scar on his body twice over, leaned toward the operator beside him and said what everyone else was thinking. "Did someone's kid get lost on the way to the visitor center?" The laughter spread through the cargo bay like a slow current. Not cruel exactly. Not mean-spirited in the way that some laughter is. More like the laughter of men who could not reconcile what they were seeing with the situation they were in. Because the situation was serious. The mission was real. And the person sent to provide overwatch for the most experienced small unit in the United States military looked like she should be worrying about a chemistry exam. Sloane Cross did not look up from her scope. She had heard worse. To understand what happened that night in Afghanistan, you have to go back 7 years. You have to go back to a training range in North Carolina on a Tuesday morning in late October when a man named Marcus Cross set a paper target at 800 meters and handed his 8-year-old daughter a rifle that was far too large for her. Marcus Cross was not a cruel man. He was not reckless. He was not the kind of father who pushed his child toward danger because he was living out some fantasy through her. He was a master sergeant in the United States Army's Delta Force, a sniper instructor with 22 years of service, a man who had trained 2 generations of operators and who understood better than almost anyone alive what skill looked like in its earliest and purest form. He was also a widower, and he was afraid. Sloane's mother had died in a car accident when Sloane was 7. A wet road, a moment of inattention, and then she was simply gone. Marcus had stood at the graveside with his daughter's hand in his and felt something shift permanently inside him. Not grief exactly, though grief was there. Something deeper. The recognition that the world did not negotiate, that it did not give warnings, that it took what it wanted when it wanted, and the only thing standing between the people you loved and the worst of what could happen was preparation. So he prepared her. Not the way some fathers prepare their children with swimming lessons and fire drills and the occasional self-defense class. Marcus Cross prepared his daughter the way he prepared operators, with structure, with repetition, with the understanding that skill is not a gift. It is a debt paid forward 1 hour at a time across years of work that most people will never see. While other children her age were memorizing multiplication tables, Sloane was learning mil-dot ranging. While they played video games on Saturday mornings, she was on the range before sunrise practicing holdovers and windage corrections until the calculations stopped being math and started being instinct. She did not complain, she did not resist. She understood even at 8 years old that her father was giving her something that looked like training, but was really something else. He was giving her himself. By the time she was 11, she could hit a stationary target at 600 meters. By 12, 800. By 13, consistently over 1,000. Her eyesight tested at 20 over 8, meaning she could see at 20 feet what most people could only resolve at 8. Her hand-eye coordination placed her in the 99th percentile of everyone ever tested at the facility. But Marcus never let her lean on those gifts. He knew better than anyone that natural talent was the most dangerous thing a shooter could have because it created the illusion that the hard part was already done. He drilled her on the things that could not be measured, on patience, on the ability to stay still, truly still, not the fidgeting stillness of someone who is trying to be still, but the deep muscular stillness of someone who has made peace with waiting. On reading wind not just through instruments, but through sensation, the way it moved across exposed skin, the way grass bent in its lowest registers, the way a column of smoke shifted before any gauge could register the change. He kept 14 notebooks. Every session, every distance, every condition, every result. 14 spiral-bound notebooks in his handwriting, dense with numbers and observations and notes in the margins where he had noticed something worth remembering. Sloan had those notebooks now. She had read each of them so many times that the covers had worn soft. There was one thing Marcus taught her that he had never taught anyone else. In the spring of 2022, after a long session on the range, he sat with her on the tailgate of his truck and reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a small mirror, scratched face slightly bent, framed the kind of object that would mean nothing to anyone who did not know the story behind it. He held it up and let the afternoon light catch its surface. "This is a technique I developed over 15 years, he said. "I have never written it in any training manual. I have never taught it at any clinic. It is yours." He showed her the angle. When everything else fails, when the technology is gone and the weather is against you and the enemy is good enough to find your scope glint, you make them look where you are not. A static flash suggests a position. A moving sweep suggests a shooter repositioning. You choose what you need them to believe, and you give them exactly that. She had practiced it for 6 months before he died. There was also a promise. That same afternoon, with the mirror warm in his hands and the North Carolina autumn going gold around them, Marcus had said something she would carry for the rest of her life. He said, "Everything I have shown you is for surviving, not for taking. You understand the difference." She said she did. He said, "Promise me, what I have given you stays inside you unless it is the only way to keep someone alive. Not to fight, not to prove anything, to protect. That is all." She promised him. 14 months later, on December 23rd, 2023, Marcus Cross died in Yemen. The mission was classified. The details exist only in documents marked for eyes that most people will never have clearance to see. What Sloan was told was that her father had been providing overwatch for a hostage rescue operation, that the operation had been compromised, and that Marcus had held his position under heavy contact for 40 minutes to allow the team to extract. He had saved 11 lives. The 12th shot had come from a sniper her father never saw in the chaos. The CIA officer who came to the door on Christmas morning did not sugarcoat it. He was a trim man in a gray coat named Philip Strang, and he had the kind of face that had learned a long time ago not to show what it was thinking. He told her what had happened. He sat with her while she processed it. He did not look away. And then, after a silence that lasted long enough to mean something, he placed a folder on the kitchen table. "Your father was identified," Strang said. "His position in Yemen was known before the mission began. We do not know by whom, but someone provided coordinates that could only have come from inside our own system." Sloan looked at the folder but did not open it. "We need someone who can operate in environments where a conventional asset would be identified immediately," Strang continued. "Someone who is not in any database the opposition has access to, someone they have not prepared for." He paused. "And we need someone with a reason to find out what happened to your father." Sloan was 14 years old. She had just buried the only person left in her world. And the man across from her was asking her to step into the thing her father had spent years preparing her for, while simultaneously asking her to operate inside the organization that might have gotten him killed. She looked at Strang for a long moment. "When do I start?" she said. 6 months of training followed at the CIA facility in Langley, Virginia. Not basic skills, she had those. The instructors who worked with her in the first week understood within 72 hours that what Sloan Cross needed was not to be taught how to shoot. She needed to be taught how to operate, how to read a tactical environment, how to communicate in the language of professionals who had been doing this since before she was born, how to be in the middle of a situation designed to produce chaos, the one person in the room who was not producing chaos herself. She was a difficult student in exactly the right ways. She asked questions that made the instructors pause. She identified inconsistencies in training scenarios that operators with a decade of experience had missed. And she had the one quality that cannot be taught, the quality that Marcus Cross had recognized in her when she was 8 years old, standing on a cold range in North Carolina, holding a rifle too big for her body. She had judgment after training 5 months of standby, briefings, intel gathering. The slow procedural business of building a dossier on a situation that was still developing. And then in early December 2024, the situation crystallized. A diplomat named Caldwell had been taken in Kunar province, moved twice, and was now reportedly being held at a remote compound in the Hindu Kush. Intelligence suggested 15 to 20 guards. The extraction window before Caldwell was moved across the Pakistani border was closing. SEAL Team 6 was tasked. Attached to the mission under call sign Sierra 7 was an asset the mission brief described only as a precision long-range shooter with specialized skills in adverse conditions. The brief did not mention her age. Commander Garrett Morrow had read the file 3 times and still had not found the detail that would explain why Langley was sending him what he was looking at in the cargo bay. He was a careful man. 17 years in special operations had given him the ability to read people quickly and accurately, to see past the surface and identify the thing underneath. What he saw when he looked at Sloane Cross was a 15-year-old girl with a rifle. What he could not yet see was everything else. "We have precision support for this operation," Morrow had told his team during the brief. "Call sign Sierra 7, long-range overwatch." He had kept his voice neutral. "She will position at elevation and provide covering fire as needed." The silence that followed had been the specific kind of silence that is louder than noise. Boone Whitaker had a reason for his skepticism that had nothing to do with Sloane's age or her size. Whitaker had been on 4 missions where a specialist attached at the last minute had nearly gotten his team killed, not through malice, but through the simple reality that combat integration requires trust built over time, not paperwork signed at Langley. He had buried 2 friends because of that gap. His skepticism was professional. It was earned. It was not unfair. He just happened to be wrong this time. Colt Reardon was the one who noticed first. Reardon was the quiet man on the team. Not quiet in the way that some men are quiet, hiding loudness beneath the surface, but genuinely fundamentally quiet. He communicated in gestures and glances, and the occasional short sentence that turned out when you thought about it afterward to have been exactly right. He had watched Sloane adjust her scope in the cargo bay, and had seen something in those small, precise movements, the no-wasted motion economy of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become indistinguishable from breathing. He filed that observation and said nothing. The Chinook dropped altitude. The mountain came up fast through the falling snow, and then the ramp opened, and the cold hit them like a wall. Not just cold, but the specific personal cold of high altitude in winter, the kind that finds every gap in your gear and reminds you that the mountain does not know your name or care about your mission. The team flowed out in formation. Sloane moved to the rear, the TAC-338 slung across her back in a custom harness that distributed its weight across her shoulders. Her boots sank into 3 feet of powder that covered what satellite imaging showed was an abandoned Soviet-era base. The compound was 200 meters northeast, pressed against a cliff face. Morrow hand-signaled the formation forward. Sloane raised her rangefinder. What she saw stopped her. 60 heat signatures, minimum, spread across the compound in a pattern that was not defensive. A disorganized cluster trying to hold a position but deliberate. The signatures were in pre-selected positions, overlapping fields of fire, flanking coverage. This was not a garrison that had been alerted. This was a unit that had been waiting. She keyed her radio. "Commander, thermal count shows 60-plus heat signatures. They are in firing positions, not defensive clusters. This is a prepared ambush." Morrow's response came back measured. "Copy. Maintain radio silence unless you have critical intelligence." She understood. She had expected it. She kept moving, but she was also thinking about the ambush configuration, about how precisely the positions covered the specific approach vector the team was using. Not the general insertion zone, the exact formation, the specific flanking coverage, the command position. That was not intelligence gathered days in advance. That was information updated in real time by someone who knew not just that SEAL Team 6 was coming, but exactly how Morrow had arranged his element for the final approach. She looked toward the main building, toward the compound where a diplomat was reportedly being held against his will. She thought about what a man in that building would need to know about the people coming to rescue him in order to position 60 armed fighters in exactly the right places. She filed that thought and kept moving. They had covered 40 meters when Sloane's eye caught movement at 11 o'clock. 800 meters upslope, barely visible through the curtain of falling snow, a figure was settling into position behind a low rock formation. The way the shoulders dropped, the weight shifting forward onto the elbows, the angle of the head tilting down toward an aim point. RPG gunner, preparing to fire. She did not have time to calculate. She had time to transmit. RPG, 11 o'clock, 800 meters. Take cover now. There was a half-second pause, the pause of a man deciding whether to trust a source he had not yet earned the right to trust, and then Morrow's voice cut through. All elements, hard cover. The team scattered. The rocket came 3 seconds later. It hit exactly where Morrow's element had been standing, the explosion, a flat crack that the snow swallowed before the sound could travel far. Shrapnel cut through the air where 11 men had been. The burnout vehicle chassis that had been their cover disintegrated. No one was hurt. In the ringing silence that followed, Sloane was already scanning for secondary threats. Her breathing was steady. 4 counts and hold 8 out, the pattern Marcus had drilled into her until it was automatic, the physiological anchor that kept the hands from shaking and the eye from losing its focus. She had not fired a single shot. She had not needed to. 50 meters to her left, Colt Reardon turned his head and looked at her through the falling snow. He said nothing. The slight inclination of his head, barely a centimeter, said what it needed to say. He had been watching. He had seen it. He understood. Boone Whitaker had also turned to look at her. The laughter from the cargo bay was gone from his face. In its place was something more complicated, not respect yet, not quite, but the first stage of what would eventually become respect. The stage where a professional realizes he may have been wrong about something and is trying to decide what to do with that realization. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he turned back to the compound. Morrow's voice came over the radio, still controlled, but carrying something different than it had 60 seconds ago. Sierra 7, good call. What else are you seeing? The positions are too precise, she said. They knew our approach vector, not just the general insertion zone, the specific formation. That is not intelligence from days ago. Someone updated them after we were in the air. The silence on the radio lasted 4 full seconds. It was the silence of a man who had just heard something he did not want to be true, processing the fact that it was probably true anyway. Maintain position, Morrow said finally. We continue. They pushed forward toward the first structure, a half-collapsed garage with rusted vehicle frames scattered around it. The team moved well, each operator filling their sector without overlap, the whole unit breathing as a single organism. Sloane followed at the rear, 20 meters back, her scope tracking the ridgelines. The rooftops, the dark openings and collapsed walls where a shooter could be invisible until the moment they chose not to be. She was watching all of it. And in the part of her mind that was not watching, she was thinking about something her father had said 3 years before he died. They had been sitting on the tailgate of his truck after a long session on the range, and he had said, "The hardest shot you will ever take is not the long one. It is not the one in the wind or the Platoon or the dark. The hardest shot is the one where you have to decide whether to take it at all. Everything else is mechanics. That one is character." She had been 12. She had nodded and thought she understood. She understood better now, because she could feel the promise sitting in her chest like a stone. She had not broken it yet. She had used her eyes, her radio, her training, but not her trigger. The RPG warning had been information, not action. She had saved 11 lives without firing a shot, but the compound was still ahead. The 60 signatures were still in their positions. And Sloane Cross understood with the clarity that comes from looking at a situation without the luxury of pretending otherwise that the radio was not going to be enough for what was coming next. The stone in her chest did not move. She adjusted her scope. She kept walking. Somewhere behind her, the Chinook was already gone, its engine noise swallowed by the storm. There was no extraction unless they made one. There were 11 operators and one 15-year-old girl, 200 meters from a compound that was waiting for them with 60 armed men and a plan. And in the Hindu Kush Mountains on Christmas Eve, with snow falling so thick it turned the world into a moving wall of white, Sloane cross-checked the turrets on her scope. One final time, felt the wind shift slightly against her left cheek, northwest gusting 20 kilometers per hour, and followed the team into the dark. Her father had given her 14 notebooks. He had given her 10,000 hours. He had given her a promise she was going to have to decide about very soon. And in her chest pocket, wrapped in a piece of cloth, he had given her the mirror. She could feel it against her ribs. She could feel his voice too, the North Carolina flatness in it, the way it went lower and more deliberate, when he was teaching something important, as if the words needed to be placed carefully. The compound loomed out of the snow ahead. The team reached the outer perimeter, and Boone Whitaker, moving to her left in the column, glanced back at her one more time. Not with laughter, now not with skepticism exactly, but with the expression of a man who is beginning to recalculate something he was certain about an hour ago. Sloan did not look back at him. She was already working. The first machine gun opened up from the rooftop at 11:47 p.m. It was a PKM Soviet-era belt-fed capable of putting down 600 rounds per minute at ranges that made cover feel theoretical. The operator behind it knew what he was doing. He swept left to right in disciplined bursts, not spraying, not panicking, working the angles with the patience of someone who had done this before and understood that patience was the difference between suppression and chaos. The SEAL team went to ground in the same instant, each operator finding cover with the automatic economy of people who have trained for this moment so many times that the body moves before the mind catches up. Morrow pressed himself against a low stone wall. Whitaker and Dex Pruitt took position behind a collapsed archway. Reardon dropped into a drainage channel that ran along the compound's eastern edge. Sloan was already moving, not toward cover. Laterally, 20 meters west toward a cluster of pine trees she had identified from the Chinook during the descent. She had noted their position the way Marcus had trained her to note everything, not consciously cataloging, just filing the way a good navigator files landmarks without stopping to think about why. The trees gave her elevation. They gave her angle. They gave her a sight line to the rooftop that the wall behind Morrow did not. She went to ground between two trunks, deployed the bipods, and was in position in 11 seconds. The PKM operator was at 645 meters, wind northwest gusting unpredictably between 15 and 25 kilometers per hour. She read the nearest pine boughs, not shaking, flexing, which meant the current gust was at the lower end. She adjusted the turret 4 clicks right, accounted for bullet drop at this distance, found the natural pause between her heartbeats. She fired. The PKM went silent. Morrow's voice on the radio was controlled but carrying something new in it. Sierra 7 confirmed rooftop suppressed. Confirmed, secondary threat emerging east doorway ground level. The figure in the doorway had an RPG launcher across his shoulder. He was moving fast, angling for a position that would give him a clear shot at the drainage channel where Reardon was pinned. Sloan tracked him, led his movement by half a step, and fired while he was still turning. The rocket detonated against the wall behind him. Reardon's voice came through, flat and steady. Good shot. That was the most words Colt Reardon had spoken all night. The firefight opened fully, then the compound's prepared positions all firing at once, and for 90 seconds it was the specific kind of chaos that training exists to manage but cannot fully prepare you for, because training is pattern and combat is noise, and the gap between them is where people die. Morrow was calling movement. Whitaker and Pruitt were putting down suppressive fire on the second-floor windows. 2 operators were pushing toward the northeast corner of the main building, using the confusion as cover. Sloan worked through it methodically. She was not fast in the way that is dramatic. She was fast the way a surgeon is fast, which is to say she was precise, and precision at this level looks like stillness, interrupted by brief moments of decision. She found each threat in the order of its danger to the team, assessed it, and resolved it. A second PKM team setting up on the compound's western wall. A fighter with a radio who was clearly coordinating positions she could not yet see. A man with a rifle who had gotten an angle on Morrow's position and was 45 seconds from using it. 12 rounds fired before she stopped counting. She would count later. She would account for everyone, but not now. Now there was only the next target, the next calculation. The wind against her cheek and the scope against her eye, and the voice of her father saying the same thing he had always said. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast, and the only shot that matters is the one you are taking right now. Then she found the tower sniper. He was in the minaret at the compound's northeastern corner, a crumbling structure that rose perhaps 15 meters above the roofline. She picked up his muzzle flash first, a brief orange stutter in the darkness, and shifted to it. Through the scope, she found his profile, a man lying prone on a platform inside the minaret, working methodically, not rushing his shots. She acquired him, started her trigger pull, and then he moved, not randomly, not with the flinch of someone who had been startled. He moved with a specific, deliberate lateral shift 2 feet left quickly and settled back into position as if the move had been planned in advance. Because it had been. Because that specific movement, that exact distance, at that exact angle was a counter-sniper technique she had seen written in one of her father's notebooks under the heading, "What a disciplined shooter does when he suspects he has been acquired." It was Delta Force doctrine. Her father had written it down in 2019. She fired anyway. The bullet hit 6 inches left of where she had aimed. The wind had shifted in the half-second between her decision and the round's arrival, and the sniper was no longer in the position she had calculated for. He had moved again, adapting, and in the scope she could see him already settling into a new position that would give him a better angle on the drainage channel where Reardon was working. Whitaker's voice cut through the radio. "Sniper in the tower just dropped Martinez. Tower sniper northeast. Someone deal with that." Sloan did not respond. She was already working the problem. The tower sniper was good. Better than good. He had changed position 3 times in 90 seconds, each new position, using the minaret's structural elements as cover, in a way that suggested he understood exactly what angles a shooter in the tree line would have available. He was not guessing. He was solving the same problem she was solving from the other side. She had encountered one person in her life who taught that level of positional awareness. She reached into her chest pocket and took out the mirror. The first technique was the static flash, a point of reflected light that suggested a fixed shooter position. She had used that once already in training, and she understood that a shooter this good would recognize a static target for what it was. She needed something different. She needed him to believe a threat was actively repositioning to cut off his angle, because a shooter doing that would force him to change his own position in a predictable way. She angled the mirror and moved it in a slow, deliberate arc. Not a flash of sweep, the kind of reflection produced by a scope lens, tracking across a field of view as a shooter moved from one position to another. She directed it 50 feet to her right and let it travel left across the snow's ambient glow. The tower sniper found it. His rifle moved to track the sweep's origin. She saw the barrel shift, saw him acquire the false position, saw the slight pause before he fired. She was already squeezing her trigger. The tower sniper fired at empty air. Sloan's round found him at 620 meters. In the half-second, he was committed to a target that did not exist. He went down and did not move. "Tower neutralized," she reported. The radio was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Morrow Sierra 7, confirmed tower KYA at 620 meters. Confirmed. Another pause. Copy. Continue overwatch. She was already scanning the ridgelines. The main firefight was moving inside the compound now. Morrow had pushed his element through a breached gate and was clearing the ground floor of the main structure. She could hear it in the radio traffic, the clipped, efficient language of men working through a building, each transmission carrying exactly the information needed and nothing else. She held her position in the trees and kept the scope moving. Northwest ridgeline, a figure barely visible through the falling snow, prone behind a rock formation. A rifle extending forward, long, heavy, with a barrel length that told her the range the shooter intended to work at. She ranged it, 100 meters. In training, her record was 1,134 meters in controlled conditions with a light crosswind and a stationary target. What she was looking at now was 1,100 meters in a blizzard with wind gusting unpredictably, and a target that had already demonstrated the ability to read a counter-sniper threat. "Commander, probable sniper establishing position northwest ridge, 1,100 meters. Morrow's voice came back strained. They were in contact inside the building. "Can you neutralize? Working on it." What followed was the grinding, patient, technically demanding work of 2 professional shooters trying to solve the same problem from opposite sides of it. She fired. The round landed short by 30 feet. The wind had gusted through a gap in the ridgeline that her calculations had not fully accounted for. The distant shooter immediately changed position, and she lost his profile in the snow. He fired back. The round cracked past her position 12 feet to the right, close enough that she could hear it, which meant he had been closer to finding her than she was comfortable with. She shifted 6 feet left into a denser section of the tree line and reacquired. They went back and forth for 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a long time in a firefight. It is long enough for people to die. And she was acutely aware that the ridgeline sniper was working his way toward a position that would give him a direct angle on the extraction point, the clearing 200 meters east where the Chinook would land. If he reached that position, he would be able to engage the team during the most vulnerable moment of the mission. Loading a helicopter, managing a rescued hostage, moving across open ground. She could not let him reach that position. She pulled out the mirror again and studied the terrain between her position and his. The rock formation he was using had a gap in its northern face. If he moved to the angle he was working toward, that gap would be on his left side, his supporting side, not his shooting side. A threat appearing to his left would force him to either expose himself, moving to a new position, or commit to a defensive angle that limited his field of fire. She used the mirror differently this time. Not the slow tracking sweep she had used on the tower sniper. She created a series of brief, sharp flashes from a point well forward of her position, the signature of a shooter who had already moved up aggressively and was preparing to fire from close range. The kind of thing that communicated one thing clearly: I already have you. The ridgeline sniper saw it. His rifle moved not to engage but to assess the threat. He was calculating where a shooter at that forward position would have him, and the answer the geometry gave him was exposed from the left: if I stay here. So he shifted to protect his left side, moving to a new position behind the rock formation's southern face. In doing so, he exposed his right shoulder, his cheek, the side of his head above the rock line. The wind died. Not fully, the gusts never fully died that night, but there was a window 3 or 4 seconds where the trees around her stopped flexing and the snow fell in something closer to vertical than diagonal. She had been waiting for that window. She fired during it. The bullet traveled for nearly 3 seconds. At that distance, in those conditions, you do not watch the target through the scope after you fire. You trust the calculation or you do not. Sloan held her position and breathed and trusted everything her father had taught her, and waited. Through the scope, she saw the rifle on the ridgeline go still. Then it moved, not the controlled movement of a shooter adjusting, but the loose, irreversible movement of a weapon being dropped. The figure behind the rocks did not move again. Northwest ridge neutralized, she said. 1,134 meters. The radio was silent for 5 full seconds. Then Whitaker's voice and the laughter from the cargo bay was entirely absent from it. Sierra 7, was that 1,100 meters in this weather? 1,134, she said, approximately. Someone on the radio said something she did not fully hear. Someone else said something else. Morrow's voice cut through. Less chatter. We have located the hostage, preparing to move. She was already back on the scope, already scanning. She found him as he emerged from a concealed entrance at the compound's southern edge. The Taliban commander was flanked by 2 bodyguards who moved with the tight, practiced formation of trained men. But Sloan was not looking at them. She was looking at the figure he was pulling behind him. A child, a girl perhaps 10 years old, wearing clothes that were too thin for the cold, her feet in shoes that were not adequate for the snow. She was not fighting. She was compliant in the specific way that people become compliant when they have learned that resistance produces pain. But her eyes were open, and she was taking in everything around her with a focus that suggested she had not given up. Sloan ranged it. 890 meters. She watched the commander's grip. His right hand was on the girl's left shoulder, positioned at the junction where the shoulder met the neck. Not a grip on clothing, not a grip on the arm. A specific, deliberate hold, fingers positioned over the trapezius and the upper neck, the thumb angled inward. A pain compliance hold. She had seen it described in her father's notebooks under a chapter about prisoner handling. It required minimal strength to apply and produced immediate compliance through pain. The body could not override it. It was also a hold that required precise positioning to maintain. And a position that required precise maintenance was a position that could be disrupted by a single variable introduced at exactly the right point. The radio crackled. Reardon, commander has a hostage, child, moving for the tree line. Whitaker, I cannot get a shot. He is using the girl as a full shield. Morrow, Sierra 7, do you have an angle? She was already calculating. 890 meters. Crosswind from the northwest current, gusts softening toward the lower range. The target was moving at roughly 2 meters per second through knee-deep snow. His right hand was on the girl's shoulder. The window she needed was the brief moment every 3 to 4 steps when the commander's weight shifted to compensate for uneven footing and his right wrist extended slightly beyond the girl's shoulder line. Half a second at 890 meters with a crosswind. I have a possible shot, she reported. High risk, target is the commander's right wrist. If I break the bone, the grip releases involuntarily. The girl should move away from the pain source instinctively. But if the wind shifts or my calculation is off by more than 2 inches, I hit the girl. Morrow confidence level. 60%. The radio was silent. She knew what 60% meant to the man on the other end. It meant a 40% chance of killing the child they were trying to save. It meant hold fire. Sierra 7, hold fire, Morrow said. We pursue on foot. Sloan kept the scope on target. The commander was 30 meters from the tree line. At his current pace, 40 seconds. Once he was in the trees, the thermal imaging would fragment, and a man who knew this terrain would be invisible in 3 minutes. The girl would be invisible with him. 25 meters. She watched his hand, watched the grip, watched the rhythm of his steps through the deep snow, the hitch and planet, the compensation, the brief moment every 4th step where his center of gravity shifted. She had not fired yet. She was watching his hand and thinking about her father's words. The hardest shot is not the long one. It is the one where you have to decide whether to take it at all. 20 meters. She watched the child's face. The girl's eyes were not closed. She was watching. She was counting. She was doing exactly what a child does when the situation is terrible, and the only agency available to her is the agency of a mind that is still working, still looking for the moment when things might change. She was ready to move. 15 meters. The wind dropped. Not the full calm she had waited for on the ridgeline, just a reduction 2 or 3 seconds, where the gusts softened and the snow fell with less horizontal pressure. Sloan cross-fired. The bullet traveled for just over 2 seconds. She watched through the scope, and she did not breathe, and she did not think, and she did not do anything except be present in the way her father had spent 10 years teaching her to be present entirely here, entirely now with nothing between her and the reality of what she had done. The commander's right wrist broke. She saw his hand release. She saw the involuntary jerk of the arm, the way the entire right side of his body responded to the shock of shattered bone, with a spasm that had nothing voluntary in it. His grip was gone before his mind registered that it should hold on. The girl dropped and rolled left, away from the pain source, exactly the direction the physics of the hold had made available to her. She was clear. "Engaging secondaries," Sloan said into the radio. Her voice was level. She fired twice. Both bodyguards went down. The commander was on his knees in the snow, clutching his shattered wrist. Reardon reached him in 40 seconds. Zip ties. Secure. The child was already being carried toward the extraction point by Pruitt, wrapped in a jacket 3 sizes too large for her. Her face was visible over his shoulder. Her eyes found the tree line where Sloan was positioned. She could not know who she was looking at. She could not see through the snow and the distance in the dark. But she was looking. And what she said in that moment, Sloan would not learn until hours later. She held the scope steady and watched the girl move towards safety and felt something she had no immediate language for. Not relief exactly, not triumph, but the specific quality of a moment when something that was going to be terrible was instead not. Morrow's voice came through the radio, carrying something it had not carried at the beginning of the night. Sierra 7. That shot at the commander's wrist. Walk me through the reasoning. She understood what he was actually asking. He was not asking for a technical briefing. He was asking how a 15-year-old had disobeyed a direct order and been right to do it. The hold he was using requires an intact grip, she said. Breaking the radial bone at the wrist produces involuntary release regardless of intention. The girl's posture suggested she was prepared to move. I assessed that the wind window gave me adequate conditions. I told you to hold fire. Yes, sir. A pause, not the pause of a man deciding. The pause of a man holding 2 things in his mind simultaneously: the order that had been disobeyed and the child who was walking toward a helicopter because of it. She is safe, he said finally. Yes, sir. Continue overwatch until we are loaded. She was already scanning. Reardon passed her position in the trees on his way back to the main group. He slowed for exactly 2 steps as he came even with her. He did not stop. He turned his head and looked at her directly, and the expression on his face was the specific expression of a man who had known something from the beginning and was now watching it confirmed. Then he was past her and moving toward the extraction point. Whitaker reached the perimeter marker 30 seconds later and stopped 4 meters from where she was prone. She was still behind the scope, still working. She was aware of him standing there. She kept working. After a moment, he said not loudly, I have been doing this for 12 years. I have worked alongside 3 people with situational awareness at your level. He paused. All 3 of them had 20 years on you and they earned it hard. Another pause. So did you, just faster. She kept the scope on the ridgeline. Then he walked toward the extraction point without looking back. The Chinook came in 23 minutes after the last shot. The team loaded fast, Caldwell the girl Martinez with his leg wound, the secured commander all the gear of a mission coming to its close. As they moved, Sloan held her overwatch position until Morrow himself signaled the all clear. She broke down her position, packed the bipod, slung the TAC-338 across her back, and walked toward the helicopter. But she did not walk directly to it. During the final minutes of the firefight, when Morrow's element had pushed into the main building to locate Caldwell, there had been a window, perhaps 4 minutes, when Sloan had moved from her overwatch position to cover the building's eastern face. The position had taken her past a secondary entrance. And through that entrance, visible in the brief wash of a flashlight moving inside, she had seen something that had made her stop. A room. A crate pushed against the eastern wall. A waterproof case inside the crate still sealed with a surface that carried no dust. The crate itself sat on a floor whose dust pattern showed it had been placed there recently, not stored position. Someone had brought it here deliberately within the last 2 weeks. She had 4 minutes and no one watching that entrance. She went in. Inside the waterproof case was a folder. The documents inside were in English, typed on paper, that carried a watermark she recognized from Langley. The cover page had a date 3 weeks prior and a single letter she recognized as a CIA station identifier. These were not archived documents pulled from a file somewhere. They had been delivered to this compound recently, which told her something important. Someone had wanted them here accessible in a location that was about to become the site of a major operation. She turned to the interior pages. The coordinates appeared on the third page. A grid reference, a date, a time. She read the numbers and felt the floor drop away from under her even though she was standing on solid ground. She read them again. She knew those coordinates. She had spent 11 months living adjacent to them, orbiting the fact of them, the specific location in Yemen, where her father had set up his overwatch position on December 23rd, 2023, timed to within 30 minutes of when he had been shot. These coordinates had not been generated by the people who had killed him. They had been sent to the people who killed him. The routing identifier in the header, a CIA internal station code, told her who had sent them. Not the individual yet, but the channel. And the channel was specific enough to make the individual findable. She held the documents for 3 seconds. She folded them, placed them in her inside jacket pocket beside the mirror, and walked out of the room. She continued Overwatch until the Chinook was on the ground. Then she broke her position and walked to the loading ramp and stepped into the noise and light of the cargo bay. She found a spot against the fuselage and sat down and closed her eyes for exactly 4 seconds. Not sleeping, not resting, just marking the end of something with a moment of stillness. Then she opened them. The documents were against her ribs. The mirror was beside them. The helicopter rose through the blizzard and banked south toward Bagram, and Sloane Cross sat in the noise of the rotors and looked at the dark above the mountains and understood that the night was over. What came next had not yet started. Bagram Airfield at 0340 hours on Christmas morning carried the specific silence of a base between operations, not quiet exactly because bases are never quiet, but the particular absence of directed noise, the machinery idling, the radios on low, the movement purposeful but unhurried. The runway lights lay across the tarmac in long pale lines. Sloane Cross stepped off the loading ramp and felt the ground under her feet and registered that the blizzard was behind them now. The sky above the airfield was clearing at its edges, the first suggestion of stars appearing where the storm had been. The ground crews moved quickly. Medical personnel were at the ramp before the rotors had fully spooled down, taking Martinez first, then Caldwell, who walked off under his own power with the careful movements of a man whose body had been through something it would take time to recover from. The Taliban commander was transferred to a holding unit by 2 men who materialized from the edge of the tarmac. Layla was handed to a woman from a humanitarian unit who had been called in when the mission's parameters had changed. The existence of a child hostage had been radioed ahead during the final approach, and someone had understood that a 10-year-old girl needed a different kind of reception than the one a military airfield normally provided. Sloane watched Layla go. The girl was wrapped in a thermal blanket now, and she was walking on her own, which meant the medic had already confirmed she was physically unharmed. She was looking back toward the group of operators still unloading gear from the helicopter, and her eyes moved across the faces with the systematic focus of someone looking for something specific. The humanitarian worker knelt beside her and spoke quietly through an interpreter. Sloane was too far away to hear the words. But she saw the girl's response, saw her turn, and look toward the tree line, toward the dark shape of the mountains, and say something to the interpreter. The interpreter relayed it to the worker, who nodded. Sloane turned away and began to field strip the T-AC-338. Morrow reached her before she had finished. He stood in front of her without speaking for a moment. She could feel the weight of what he was about to say in the silence before he said it. The silence of a commander who is furious but controlled is different from the silence of a commander who is satisfied. Both produce quiet. Only one of them produces the specific kind of stillness that comes from a man choosing his words because the wrong ones will not carry what he means. This was that kind of silence. "I gave you a direct order," Morrow said. "Yes, sir." "Hold fire." Those were the words. She said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. "You fired anyway." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. His voice had been at the same level it was always at, slightly lower than most people's, carrying its weight, not through loudness, but through precision. Every word was placed. Nothing was wasted. Walk me through it, he said. She had already given him the technical summary on the radio. He was not asking for that again. The hold he was using on her shoulder was a pain compliance grip, she said. Standard prisoner control technique. To maintain it effectively, you need an intact grip which requires bone continuity in the wrist. If the radial bone breaks, the hand opens. Not because the person decides to open it, because the body cannot maintain grip tension through that kind of structural failure. She paused. The girl's posture told me she was aware of her surroundings. She was watching. She was ready to move. I assessed that the wind conditions and the movement rhythm gave me an adequate window. I told you to hold. Your order was based on a 60% assessment. I was the one looking through the scope. My assessment changed. To what? High enough to take the shot. Reardon appeared at the edge of the conversation. He had not been summoned. He had simply positioned himself nearby, and now he spoke. Commander, Reardon said. She called 4 threats tonight before any of us saw them. She identified the ambush configuration as prepared, not reactive, before we confirmed it. She neutralized 3 RPG positions, a tower sniper, and a ridgeline shooter at 1,100 meters, all in a blizzard. He stopped. I have been doing this for 11 years. I have worked with 3 people who had situational awareness at her level. All 3 were 20 years older and had already earned it the hard way. He paused. She earned it the hard way too, just faster. Reardon said nothing else. He moved away. Morrow looked at where Reardon had been standing and then looked back at Sloane. The tarmac was quiet around them. Somewhere behind her, she could hear Whitaker and Pruitt talking in the low, easy voices of men letting the tension out of a long night. The girl is safe, Morrow said finally. It was not an absolution. It was not a reprimand. It was a statement of fact that contained both things and asked her to sit with the weight of both of them simultaneously. Yes, sir, she said. He nodded once. Write your account of the wrist shot before 0600. Everything you saw, everything you calculated, everything that went into the decision. I want it on record in your own words. Yes, sir. He turned toward the operations building, then stopped without turning back. My report will note that Sierra 7 demonstrated independent tactical judgment inconsistent with standing orders, he said. It will also note that the outcome of that judgment was consistent with mission objectives and that 0 friendly casualties resulted. A pause. Write the account. He walked away. She closed the rifle case and stood for a moment looking at the mountains she could now barely see in the clearing dark and breathed. Philip Strang found her 20 minutes later outside the operations building, her back against the concrete wall. He looked at her the way he had looked at her 11 months ago on that first morning. The face that showed nothing but the eyes that were always assessing. She reached into her jacket without a word and handed him the documents. He took them, looked at the cover page, turned to the interior, read the coordinates and the date and the routing identifier. He was quiet for a long time. She watched his face. How long have you had this, he said. Since approximately 2315 local. I accessed the room during the hostage extraction window. The crate had been placed there recently within 2 weeks. Someone delivered it to that compound deliberately. He looked up from the documents. I have suspected since late 2022 that your father's position was compromised from inside the system, Strang said. He held the documents in both hands and did not look at them while he spoke. He looked at her. I did not have evidence. I had patterns that pointed in a direction and nothing that would constitute actionable intelligence. He paused. I made a decision not to share that suspicion with you when I recruited you. I told myself it was because an unconfirmed theory would bias your judgment on the mission. That was part of the reason. Another pause. The rest of the reason was that I had spent 2 years failing to prove it, and I did not want you to know that. He did not say he was sorry. She understood why. Saying sorry was what you did when you wanted the other person to feel better. It was not what you did when you wanted them to understand the truth. The routing identifier, she said, is it traceable? To a station, and from the station to an individual. He placed the documents carefully inside his coat. It will take time. It will require people above my clearance level to pursue it correctly, but it will be pursued. He held her gaze. You have my word. She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about the specific quality of Strang's word. She had spent 11 months observing him, the gap or the absence of a gap between what he said he would do and what he subsequently did. He was not a clean man. No one who did this work was clean, but he was consistent, and consistency was the thing that mattered most in the people you had to trust when you had no other option. Caldwell, she said. Strang's expression did not change. His capture was not what it appeared to be, Strang said. The compound was his arrangement. He was not a hostage. He was a principal. He paused. The footage from your scope combined with the Taliban commander's testimony, which began approximately 40 minutes ago, and is proving detailed, creates a case that will not require inference. It will require only assembly. She thought about what she had seen through the scope. Caldwell directing the interpreter before the team came through the door. The way he had moved through the building when the team extracted him, not the stumbling relief of a man who had been a prisoner, but the controlled movement of a man who knew exactly where he was going. When, she said, before he boards a transport home. She nodded. Strang looked at her for a moment more. The Taliban commander also confirmed that the ambush tonight was fed by live intelligence updates. The last update was received 90 minutes before SEAL Team 6 landed. It contained the specific formation change Commander Morrow made during the final approach. She had known this in the way she had known it since she first identified the precision of the ambush positions. But hearing it stated plainly changed the way it sat in her. How many people had access to that formation change, she said. 3, Strang said, including Morrow himself. He let that sit for a moment. We will find the 2 others. He went inside. She stayed where she was and watched the sky above the mountains continue its slow conversion from black to gray. The sound came from her right, Whitaker's footsteps, the specific rhythm of a large man moving at a controlled pace. He stopped beside her and looked at the same mountains she had been looking at. I have been doing this long enough to have been wrong about a lot of things, he said. I am usually pretty good at recognizing it when I am. He was quiet for a moment. Marcus Cross ran a marksmanship clinic at Bragg in the spring of '98. I was 22 years old and I thought I could shoot. He spent 2 hours taking apart everything I believed about what I was doing and putting it back together in a form that actually worked. Another pause. I made 5 shots at the end of that session that I had never made before in my life. I have thought about that clinic many times over the years. I never had occasion to tell him what it meant. He paused. I am telling you because you should know it. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the mountains. He would have said it was just good instruction, she said. He would have been wrong, Whitaker said. Good instruction is common. What he did in those 2 hours was show a 22-year-old who did not know what he did not know the gap between where he was and what was possible. That is not instruction. He paused. It is legacy. You know what your father's legacy looks like because you are standing on it. 11 people walked to this helicopter tonight instead of being carried to one. That goes back to him. She heard her father in those words. Not his voice, the sound of his voice was hers alone, but the structure of the thought, the specific way a man of Marcus Cross's character understood the relationship between what you did and what it produced after you were gone. The tears came without warning quickly and without apology hot against her cold face. She did not try to stop them because stopping them would have required a kind of pretending she was not capable of tonight. Whitaker did not look away. He did not offer comfort or reassurance. He just stood there present, which turned out to be exactly what the moment needed. She let it pass. She breathed through it, and it moved. My father used to say that snipers do not cry, she said. Whitaker was quiet for a moment. Men in this line of work say a lot of things to manage the weight of it. Some of those things are true, and some are things you tell yourself because the alternative is harder. He paused. Your father kept 14 notebooks. A man who keeps 14 notebooks is not a man who believes the things he cannot feel do not exist. She thought about the notebooks, about the last entry mid-page November 14th, 2023. Next session tests the mirror technique in low-light conditions. She is ready for it. 5 weeks before he died. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Thank you, she said, for what you said. He reached into his vest and held something out. A SEAL Team 6 patch, not a spare, the actual worn patch from his operational vest, carrying the specific history of years of service in it. She understood what that meant. A spare patch was a gesture. This was the thing itself. Regulations say we cannot officially do this, he said. Unofficially, you earned it before we cleared the first ridgeline. She took it, held it for a moment. Then she put it in her chest pocket next to the mirror and the documents that were going to change everything. Morrow emerged from the operations building an hour later and found her at a table with a notebook open in front of her, writing the account of the wrist shot. He sat down across from her without being invited, which she understood was not rudeness, but the prerogative of a commander in his own space. When she had reached the end of the section she was working on, she put down the pen. My report goes to the Pentagon in 4 hours, he said. There will be a review. I want you to know what I intend to say. He told her. He told her about the section on Sierra 7, the specific language he had chosen, the assessment he was making of her skills and judgment. He told her about the recommendation he was including, which was not a standard recommendation, and which he expected to generate significant discussion. You do not have to do that, she said. I am aware. The legal complications, the oversight requirements. Also aware, she looked at him. He was a man who had made his decisions about who he was a long time ago and had not needed to revisit them since. Your father saved 11 people on a mission designed to fail, Morrow said. I was not there, but I know two of the men who were. They told me what he did. They told me he held his position when holding his position was the choice that made the most difference and also the choice that killed him, he paused. Tonight you held your position in a different sense. You stayed on what mattered. You did not get pulled into the noise. A pause. That does not come from training. Training gets you close. That specific quality comes from character. It was his. Now it is yours. Oui, she said. He would tell you character is just training you took seriously. Morrow almost smiled. He sounds like someone I would have wanted to work with. He was, she said. She turned back to the notebook and continued writing. What happened in the operations building that same morning was not something Sloan witnessed directly, but Strang told her afterward in the flat factual language he used when he wanted her to understand something without editorializing around it. Caldwell had been preparing to board a transport back to Washington. He had been debriefed, had given a prepared statement about his captivity, and had been cleared by the base medical officer. He was walking toward the aircraft with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who believes the difficult part is behind him. Strang had met him on the tarmac with two other men in a folder. The folder contained three things: a still image from the Sloan scope footage showing Caldwell directing the Taliban interpreter before the team's entry, a transcript of the first 40 minutes of the Taliban commander's interrogation identifying Caldwell as the primary contact for intelligence on the SEAL team's movement, and a page from the recovered compound documents showing a communication routed through a channel that Caldwell had exclusive access to. Caldwell had looked at the folder for a long time, then he had said nothing, which Strang noted was the response of a man who had been a diplomat long enough to know when words would not help him. He had been restrained on the tarmac in the early morning light while Morrow's team was 300 meters away, completing their own debrief, and the transport he had expected to board had departed without him. The Pentagon review took place 3 days later in a small conference room with fluorescent lights and a flag in the corner. General Morrison led it. He was a careful man who asked his questions in the specific order of someone who wants to understand something correctly rather than confirm what he already believes. He asked Sloan about her training, about the mission, about specific decisions and the reasoning behind them. He did not editorialize. He listened. When he had heard enough, he closed the file. I am going to make a recommendation that will generate significant paperwork, he said. A special operational category for Sierra 7, limited deployment, extensive oversight, mandatory psychological evaluation every 60 days. If at any point the assessment indicates that continued operational activity is producing harm, we pull the asset out immediately, fully, and without negotiation. He looked at Sloan steadily. And you continue your education. Full course load, maintained cover identity. Whatever you are outside of this room, you are completely. She thought about chemistry class, about the quiet of a school hallway in January. I understand, she said. Good, Morrison said, because the alternative, pretending this asset does not exist and does not have these capabilities, is a choice that costs lives. He paused. Your father understood that. His record indicates he spent 22 years making sure the people around him were better at their jobs than they would otherwise have been. That is a form of service that does not show up in citations. He looked at the file. It shows up in the people. Strang drove her to the airport. It was a gray January morning, Washington in winter, the bare trees and low sky producing the monochrome of a city that has been here longer than any of its current inhabitants. They drove without speaking for several minutes. Caldwell, she said, formally charged and in federal custody, Strang said. The charges are sealed pending full investigation. He will not be speaking with anyone on the outside for a long time. He paused. The scope footage and the commander's testimony created a case that the relevant people found persuasive. It will take time for the full scope to be established, but the thread is in our hands now. My father, she said. That investigation is active. He did not look away from the road. The routing identifier traces to a station. The station narrows to 3 individuals with access during the relevant period. We have already eliminated 1. 2 remain. A pause. It will reach where it needs to reach. I will see to that personally. She looked out the window. She thought about the coordinates on that document, the specific numbers that had traveled from inside the CIA to the hands of people who used them to aim. She had carried those numbers from a room in an Afghan compound, through a blizzard and a helicopter, and 3 days of institutional process. They had arrived where they needed to arrive. What happened to them now was in other hands. She had to hold that fact steadily, the way you hold a calculation you have run correctly and trust the result of, even when you would prefer a different answer. At the airport, Strang handed her a secure phone, 3 numbers in the contacts. He also handed her a small box. Inside the box was a challenge coin, heavy milled metal, the seal treated it on one side and on the reverse engraved in clean capital letters. Sierra 7 December 2024, 2024, 0 casualties. She turned it over in her hand. They do not make those for exercises, Strang said. She put it in her pocket. She already knew where it would live next to the mirror, which was where it belonged. One more thing, Strang said. He was looking at the terminal entrance rather than at her, which she had learned was the way he delivered information that carried more weight than he wanted to show on his face. The girl, Layla, when the humanitarian worker asked her who had saved her, the interpreter relayed her answer. He paused. She said an angel came out of the snow. She kept asking if she could thank the angel. Another pause. She is being relocated to a safe house in Kabul. She starts school in February. Sloan looked at the mountains she could not see from this city. Good, she said. It was a small word for what she meant, but it was the right one. She picked up her bag. Agent Strang, she said. He looked at her. Find who did it, she said. All the way to the source. Yes, he said, not a reassurance, an operational commitment. She heard the difference and was satisfied by it. She walked into the terminal. 3 years passed. They passed the way time passes when you are living 2 lives in parallel, not slowly, not quickly, but with the specific quality of time that is too full to examine closely while it is happening. She went to high school and took her tests and had conversations about things that mattered to her classmates, and she did all of this completely without performance because the person she was in those hallways was not a cover. It was her, the part that existed independent of everything else. Marcus Cross had raised her to understand that a human being was more than the most dramatic thing they were capable of. She also ran 17 classified missions between January 2025 and March 2027. Most of them she will not speak about. Some of them will eventually appear in documents declassified in 20 or 30 years, and the people who read those documents will not know how old the shooter in the field was at the time because the records do not include that detail. What the records include is the call sign and the outcome. The outcomes are consistent. The phone rang in April of her 15th year, February of her 16th, July of that same year, and with increasing frequency after that, as the people who tasked Sierra 7 came to understand both the capability and its reliability. Each time she went, each time she came back. The psychological evaluations every 60 days produced reports that said the same thing in different language across 12 sessions until Dr. Webb, who had worked with special operations personnel for 20 years and who was Sloan had concluded. After their 3rd session, genuinely good at her job, said something in their 12th meeting that Sloan thought about often afterward. You carry your father's voice like a compass, Webb had said. That is either the most useful thing a person can have or the most limiting. The difference is whether you know when the terrain has changed. Sloan had not answered immediately. She had thought about it for 3 days. When she understood what Webb meant, she wrote it in the margin of the 14th notebook on the last page below her father's last entry about the mirror technique. She had added one line beneath his, and the handwriting was different, faster, more abbreviated, the writing of someone who had learned through years of practice which details mattered, but the notebooks were now continuous. His 14 pages and hers, one record. In October 2026, the investigation reached its conclusion. Strang called her on the secure line on a Tuesday morning while she was walking between classes at Georgetown. He spoke for 4 minutes. She stood on the sidewalk with students moving around her carrying coffee and backpacks and the ordinary freight of an ordinary day, and she listened to all of it. He told her that the 2 remaining individuals with access to the Yemen routing channel had been identified and that both were now in federal custody. He told her that the full scope of the network they had operated within was still being mapped, but that the central architecture was intact and accounted for. He told her that Marcus Cross's name appeared in internal prosecution documents as a victim of deliberate intelligence compromise. He told her that the people responsible were going to prison. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You started this, in that room in the compound." She stood on the Georgetown sidewalk for a moment after the call ended and watched the students moving past her. A girl in a green jacket was laughing at something on her phone. Two men were arguing amiably about something she could not hear. A professor walked past with a stack of papers under one arm and a coffee going cold in the other hand, the specific distracted expression of someone composing a sentence in their head while their body navigated the world on autopilot. She put her phone in her pocket and walked to class. Sloane Cross turned 18 in March of 2027. On the morning of her birthday, she was in her dorm room at Georgetown, where she was carrying a 3.97 GPA that was not perfect and therefore did not draw attention to itself the way a 4.0 might. Her roommate had given her a birthday card. Her advisor had sent an email about spring course registration. The dining hall was serving waffles, which was not a birthday accommodation, but a Thursday coincidence. The letter from the Department of Defense arrived through a secure courier who handed it to her in the lobby of her dormitory building, addressed to her legal name, with no indication of its origin. She read it in the elevator on the way back up. It was 3 paragraphs. The first noted her service and described it as exemplary. The second outlined a formal offer of full operational status in careful bureaucratic language. The third paragraph was the one she read twice, not because it was complex, but because it was signed by 3 people whose names together represented something she needed a moment to hold. The commanders of SEAL Team 6 Delta Force and the CIA Special Activities Division. She sat on the edge of her bed. She opened the drawer of her desk and took out the 3 things that lived there. The mirror first, scratched face-bent frame warm from the wood of the drawer. She turned it over in her hand and set it on the desk. The challenge coin next. She set it beside the mirror. The third thing was a page from a newspaper folded carefully into quarters. She unfolded it and smoothed it on the desk. The headline was from 14 months ago. Former diplomat Caldwell convicted 40 years for treason, conspiracy, and procurement of classified intelligence for foreign adversaries. She had read the article many times. The routing identifier appeared in it, described in redacted form as classified communications intercepted at a CIA internal station. A related paragraph noted that 2 additional individuals had been convicted in associated proceedings. Their names remained sealed. Her name was not in the article. Marcus Cross's name was not in the article. That was how it worked. That was how it was supposed to work. The people who did this did not appear in the public account of it, and the people who benefited from it went home to their lives and their families and their Thursday morning waffles without knowing the specific names and ages and losses of the people who had made that ordinary morning possible. Her father had understood this. He had spent 22 years doing work that was not in any public record and had not measured its value by what appeared in any record. He had measured it in outcomes in the people who came home in the operations that achieved their objectives, in the 11 operators who walked away from a compromised mission in Yemen because one man had held his position for 40 minutes. She picked up her phone and dialed. Morrow answered on the second ring. He was at Dam Neck in the middle of the pre-mission cycle for an operation that had not been shared with her yet. "Sir," she said, "this is Sierra 7. "I know who it is," he said. "The letter came this morning." "I know," he said. "I signed it." She looked at the 3 objects on her desk. The mirror, the coin, the newspaper folded back into quarters creased at exactly the folds it had always been folded, at the paper worn soft from the number of times it had been opened and closed. "I am ready for full-time operational status," she said. There was a brief pause on the line, not the pause of a man deciding. The pause of a man who had known what the answer would be and was taking one moment to mark the fact of it. "You have been ready," Morrow said. "We have been waiting for you to be old enough for the paperwork." She almost laughed. It was not the kind of thing she did easily, especially on the phone, but there was something in his voice that made it possible, the specific warmth of a tone that contains years of accumulated context, the warmth that is not sentiment but history. "When do I report?" she said. "Monday," he said. "Bragg, you know where." She did know where. She had been there 100 times as a child, standing next to her father on ranges that were familiar to her before she was old enough to understand what they were. She knew every building, every road, the particular quality of the North Carolina autumn, the way the pine trees on the eastern side of the post smelled after rain. She knew the rooms where Marcus Cross had stood for 22 years and taught people to do something well, where he had kept notebooks and drilled fundamentals and said the things that were still being heard by the people who had heard them and carried them forward. She gathered the objects from the desk. The mirror went into her inside jacket pocket where it had always lived. The coin went into her right front pocket. The newspaper she folded one final time and put in the desk drawer and did not take with her. She did not need to carry it anymore. It had done what it needed to do. She picked up her bag and walked out of the room and down the corridor toward the elevator. As she passed the second-floor study room, she saw through the glass panel in the door a freshman she had tutored twice in the fall semester, a girl who had knocked on Sloane's door with a specific question that showed she had been thinking carefully about their first session. Sloane had spent 40 minutes at a whiteboard with her. The girl had come back a second time with a better question, which meant she had been working. She was sitting alone now, with a textbook open and a legal pad covered in notes, and she was doing the specific thing that serious students do when they are getting somewhere. She was writing in the margins. Small notes in cramped handwriting, the kind that would only make sense to the person who wrote them. Sloane did not stop. She did not knock on the glass. She just walked past the door and down the stairs and out into the gray March morning, where the quad was beginning to fill with the first people of the day, students and faculty, in the ordinary movement of a world going about its business in the morning light. She thought about the girl in the study room, about the notes in the margins, about 14 spiral-bound notebooks in a drawer in North Carolina dense with numbers and observations, the covers worn soft, about a woman from a humanitarian unit kneeling on a tarmac in Afghanistan, relaying a 10-year-old girl's question to an interpreter, and the answer coming back, she wants to thank the angel who came out of the snow. About Whitaker placing a patch in her hand on a cold tarmac and saying, "Marcus Cross showed me the gap between where I was and what was possible." She did not know if any of it added up to something she had a word for. Her father would have said she was overthinking it. He would have said, "You know what it is. You have always known. You are just deciding whether to claim it." She claimed it. She walked across the quad toward the parking lot where her car was waiting, and the morning was cold and clear, and the sky above Georgetown was the specific pale blue of early spring. And somewhere ahead of her, a phone would ring and a mission would begin, and she would do what she had always done, what Marcus Cross had built into her, through 10,000 hours and 14 notebooks and one small scratched mirror, and a promise that had cost her something real and been worth every cent of that cost. She walked toward it without hesitation. She did not look back. The youngest full-status operator in the history of the Special Activities Division had just officially reported for duty. The record would not reflect her age. The record would not reflect her name. The record would reflect only what had always been true about her and what Marcus Cross had known when she was 8 years old, standing on a cold range in North Carolina, holding a rifle too big for her body. That she was ready. That she had always been ready. That she was her father's daughter in every way that mattered, and in several ways that would take the world a long time to fully understand.